I think it's important to understand the trade-offs in each of these cases, right? So for example, we sort of know what would happen if you turned off, let's say, ads on Google search. How much better would it be for people? If you turned off ads on YouTube, how much would be better for your people? But you also understand the costs. Okay, how much less money would we make? And so finding that balance, right, across your product, which is when this happens, what is the trade-off and what am I giving up, is super important.
My name's Isabel, and this is your Product Thinking Toolbox. Satyajeet Salgar is the Director of Product Management at YouTube and Google. With an impressive background in technology and media, Satyajeet has led a ton of teams and scaled multiple 1 billion plus MAU and 100 million plus MAU products while driving innovation and creativity across various dimensions. Currently, he spearheads YouTube shopping initiatives, focuses on live shopping, search, and discovery, as well as initiatives for merchants and creators. With a wealth of experience in Google, he's played vital roles in Google Discover, Google Search, YouTube Live, and games, and serves as a mentor and speaker at renowned graduate schools. And also a fun fact that I found out is that you're a father of two and a fan of Ted Lasso. So keep me honest there, Satyajit. Welcome to the
That is
podcast.
accurate. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to chat. Yeah, I guess now that we're on Zoom, you can clearly see I think it's no longer like it's pretty obvious, but yeah, definitely a big Ted Lasso fan too.
And do you feel like your love for Ted Lasso influences like how you approach your dynamic with your kids? And
I think it was more Ted Lasso was like, oh, see, you can be successful doing this too, and I was like, oh, this is it was a way to like mirror what I felt like some of what I was doing, but I think Ted Lasso sort of ups it up dramatically and shows like you can be successful being kind, which I really like. But yeah, I think it's a show that teaches like believing in things and patience, which with kids is very, very necessary. So I think it works for that.
that's fair. And I assume, and the reason why I found this out was I remember seeing on your LinkedIn that you had a post about how Ted Lasso also has a big influence on just like leading teams and also how you can show up for
There's
your.
a talk that I need to do about how you can be a better PM following these 10 things from Ted Lasso. Like I just need to write that. Like I know what that talk would be. I need to actually write that down and give it at some point. But
Well, we'll have to
100%.
do part two. Interview
Yeah,
one to that doc. We'll just have to go through each of the steps because I think with just like product in general, it's always just this weird gray area of what do PMs really do? Are we product owners? Are we,
yeah,
project managers, etc.? So 100%. We'll have to chat about that.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's kickstart because we're talking about the industry and we're talking about
Mhm.
just like your wealth of experience. As you can tell, especially with Google, especially with YouTube, we can see right now that AI and machine learning are transforming products, right,
Mhm.
across industries. And YouTube and Google is in an interesting space because you're kind of parked in between a plethora of industries.
Mhm.
So because of that, how has YouTube and Google incorporated AI and machine learning to enhance your product capabilities and improve your user interactions?
So it's interesting. So let me maybe break this up into two parts, right? So I spent a lot of time on Google search, and I think just sort of, and I'm on YouTube now, but before I went to search, I was on YouTube as well. So I spent a bunch of time on YouTube. The interesting part is, if you use AI in like the broadest sense of the word, right? Like I think it has been critical to both YouTube and search for a really long time. So I think so a lot of engineers in particular, when you kind of say like, oh, it's changed now, go like, no, but it's been important for like forever, right? So I think I remember like especially for our discovery and recommendation systems, for ads, like AI has been critical to like pushing the success of like YouTube and ads for forever. Obviously, sort of there are a bunch of external papers about how rank brain, which is sort of some of our ranking for search, has been a critical signal for a long time. So in some ways, it's always sort of been there. But I think what's happened in the last, let's call it 8, 9 months, maybe a year in particular, is the advances with large language models in particular have been so significant, particularly for a product like search, but also things like YouTube. It's pretty obvious what will happen next, right? So I think some combination of large language models and what we're seeing with with imagery and video being generated. So generative AI as a whole, I think, just is a significant change. And you can see it already, right? Like you can sort of see, I mean, search looks, if you're opted into what's called like the search generative experience, it is, transformatory for how you use search. Just like, I think when people saw where ChatGPT was, it accelerated a bunch of work that otherwise would have taken much longer. And similarly, I think for YouTube, there's a sense that like the creative tools that you have are as a creator will change dramatically with AI. How should we lean into it? But I think like AI sort of now affects not just sort of the big things, but also the small things. There are little things you can do dramatically better. And I think, they've always been around in the back ends of the system, but I think now some of those will make their way to consumers more easily. For example, I think YouTube just released maybe a couple of weeks ago this feature that sort of writes a text summary of the video, which it can now do because a lot of language models allow that, and lets you use YouTube more efficiently. So I think it's going to be transformatory for in small ways and big ways in how we sort of use a lot of these products. Yeah, it's going to be transformatory in sort of what we build, but also how we build it. Like I think PMs will use AI very differently even as we come up with things.
Ooh, let's unpack that a little bit, because
Yeah.
AI and machine learning can be pretty complex technologies to integrate. And you've seen, I don't know if you've seen, but I've seen a lot of organizations and businesses kind of using AI and ML as the buzzword of we use
Mhm.
AI and ML, so therefore we have value.
Uh,
But how do you approach, let's say, explaining the value and explaining kind of the impact of AI powered features to users, especially you mentioned that it might be obvious, but
yeah.
maybe to users it might not be apparent. For example, search is one of
Yep.
those big questions of like AI, what is the difference?
So I think in an ideal world, I think when you're building products, you don't really think about you shouldn't need to explain AI to your users. I think you should be able to explain how you're satisfying their needs better and how you're solving problems for them. It may be that AI is now the tool or some set of tools that you're using to like solve it, or you're using frankly like sort of generative AI to come up with the ideas to solve their stuff. But I think people can be extracted away from that. I think what happens sometimes is sometimes you need to explain to consumers what's happening, right? So I think, for example, like we've now seen, sort of in some cases they're demos, in some cases people opt in, but there are these you can use AI to help you write a document or write an email, and I think there people know that this is I sort of know what's happening, but what you need to explain to them is, hey, you now need to know how to we'll help you write the thing, but now need to know how to edit it. You need to know how to like teach it your style, all of that stuff. So I think that's where explaining it to consumers comes in. But really, the way to think about it is, okay, how is this a tool that now helps me either make the thing that I was giving them better, or like just come up with something new to satisfy the same need. And I think that for me, AI is like it's not just what we build, it's how we build. Like I was telling folks a little while ago, it's changed how I sort of brainstorm. For example, it was a lot easier. Like earlier, I would just sit and sort of doodle with paper and then research on the side. Now I find that if you use either ChatGPT or Bard as like a thought partner, I find like it's like, oh, what about this? And like, can you compare those two tables and tell me what's happening? And then you go like, okay, now I'll sit and think about what that data says. I find that is almost like I find I was able to make like I make dramatically more progress like in a couple of hours than I used to. So I think
And
it's all of those things.
right. I think that it's going back to your point about making sure that we're highlighting some sort of value to help enable users
That's right.
to get to the outcome that they want to accomplish, essentially.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. And also one other thing that you pointed out was like, even as PMs, sometimes we should probably play around with these tools because it's so easy for us to just jump on the bandwagon of, new feature, new type of technology. Let's just embed it into our tech stack as fast as possible without actually what you mentioned, using BART, using ChatGPT to be that thought partner.
Yeah. No, I think to your point, like the thing that you mentioned earlier, right? There is a little bit of there was a team that I used to work with that I was curious, and I was chatting with one of the PMs there, and I was like, oh, let me see how's AI changed your plans, and so he sent me some stuff, and I was like, oh, this looks a lot like your old plans with the word AI sprinkled in. He's like, you're not wrong. We're still working on it. So I think to some extent there's this general, as you mentioned, right? There's this general like, oh, we have to use AI piece, and I think some of that will die down. And so as then people will figure out, okay, how is this actually useful? It's like, every other startup that I talk to is now an AI startup, and I was like, wait, you're doing the same thing you did like 6 months ago. But I think again, part of it is the story, part of it is capturing the excitement. It's very natural, it's very human. But I think a lot of it is, as people understand more deeply what it can do for them, they'll have better ideas, come up with better insights, and go from there.
I actually want to pull onto one of the threads
Yeah.
that you mentioned about experiencing the product yourself, having AI sprinkled into the mix. What do you think about the concept of dog fooding? Do you think that your team does that enough or
Yeah.
not enough?
I feel like most of the times things don't dog food enough. Dog fooding is you try the thing that you're building before you release it out in the world. Now, I think there's a question of like, sometimes are you even the right people to get feedback from? Like, let's put it this way: I think PMs, engineers, people around the product should live their product. I think it's really important. Almost my first PM job, I remember the senior leader on the team asked, and it was an ads product that I was sort of working on at the time, asked like a bunch of people, how many of you like some of you, I was new to the team, but some of them have been working on the product for like a year or so. How many of you actually use this end to end? And the answer was like, no one, like 1%. And it was because again, they were doing their jobs right, but do you naturally in your world as a PM run your own ads campaign, debug things? Like, no, you sort of watch other people are doing it, right? And so I think it's really important, even though sometimes it's really hard, to use the product you're responsible for every single day. So I think using the product, like even before dog fooding, right, is really, really important. Having a feel of that. And then to your point, like, okay, you've got new ideas, can you dog food it and all that stuff. But the thing I always warn people is sometimes you're not the consumer, right? So you should be, dog food data is data, but it shouldn't, like, you shouldn't assume that that is like you should learn from it. It shouldn't be like a gate. For example, there's I probably can't, I won't go into the details, but there was a product that I was responsible for. Dog food feedback wasn't great, but I was like, wait, we're dog fooding with a bunch of Googlers, not the user for this, not the user for this. And by the way, like, it wasn't like dog, the kind of people that opt into a dog food, you get sort of a variance anyway. And so as a result, I was like, okay, I think we can go ahead even despite this dog food feedback. But it is incredibly important data. And I think teams that don't dog food actually get into trouble, right? Like, if you don't have some way to go back and forth with some set of users. And I think if, as a team, you're not those users, or people in your company are not those users, that is a red flag for me. So you need to find some way to do that.
And the other end of the spectrum too, it's like sometimes there might not be the right types of users that experience a product, and then hence they aren't providing the right types of inputs for that specific product. But then there's the other hand of sometimes there is a misconception, I guess, of PMs having to be the experts in that specific field when they get hired, right? So for example, if it's a medical software, it's like maybe PM should be a doctor, but actually a lot of the times it's what are the, again, going back to our previous discussion, mental models that a PM uses to make the best decisions at that time.
Yep, no, that's right. I think it's when you, especially if it's not an area that you have domain expertise in, right? It's very hard to like come in and be the expert. And so I think to your point, like then sort of having a set of frameworks that you can apply helps you until like, you've spent enough time where it feels like, okay, I now have expertise in this. And it's something, sort of, I think I've tried to do on jobs that I've gone on PMs on my team, managers, as well as ICs. I sort of tell them like, in time, you're expected to be the expert. But again, I think you need time, and it takes a while sometimes to get there.
Yeah. Well, you are one of those experts. That's why we're having this conversation, right?
Oh, thank you.
So I'm curious to hear your personal take on What types of mental models do you use to develop products at YouTube Shopping? And are there specific mental models that stand out and address, let's say, specifically needs of merchants, creators, and users in this highly competitive space?
Yeah, there's a few, but I think maybe the thing most important in shopping is you know, understanding the ecosystem and understanding the incentives of the ecosystem, and that everyone needs to sort of do well. You mentioned there's creators, there's viewers or shoppers, and in the case of shopping, there's merchants, right? And I think this really, like, YouTube shopping works only if everyone in that loop is actually getting the ROI that they expect, right? Merchants are like, when I invest in YouTube shopping, I get this out of it. Creators actually see either sort of better content being created or more revenue, or they're able to sell. In many cases, creators are also merchants and brands, so they're selling their own stuff. And viewers need to feel like, oh, I got something as a viewer and a shopper on YouTube that I didn't get anywhere else. So I think you need to sort of one model is to understand, okay, what is the incentive of every sort of party in this, and is the strategy that I have, is the offering that we have, is the business model that we have, does it work for each of them? And not just does it work for each of them, is it better than their alternative, right? Like, how does it compare with what else they have, right? So I think one of those things about, is it useful, is it, how does it compare to their alternatives, why should they consider it, for each party is very important. The second thing to think about is, very often these things are loops, right? Which is, once you have a lot of viewers and they're comfortable watching it with creators, then you get a lot of merchants, and so you need to get those loops going. But there's always a cold start problem, right? And so I think a lot of the test is, okay, what is the safest way to sort of cold start some of these things, right? Like, do you go get the merchants first and say like, hey, like, come on, we've got these creators coming? Do you sort of tell the creators like, no, no, start like selling these products, we'll get these viewers and merchants onto you? How do you do that? And understanding sort of what part of the ecosystem has patience, which part you can sort of come back to and say like, okay, now we've made these improvements, come back, is really important. And understanding, okay, these are people, for example, I can give incentives to for a while, and I won't need to in the long run because this will work out. I think that's another sort of mental model that when you're in sort of any dynamic marketplace system, you need to think a lot about, which is, how do I get the loops going, and what can I sort of provide a boost to that, once goes away, all of this still works. So how do you get flywheels going, especially in this marketplace dynamic, is always interesting to think about.
That's such a complex problem to solve that I think a lot of orgs struggle with. Firstly, that cold start problem. And then there's almost this interreliance between different parts of the marketplace.
100%.
How do you even, you mentioned something about patience, you mentioned something about threshold and sensitivity or market sensitivity. When you think about prioritizing specific initiatives to unblock that cold start problem within, let's say, the less or the more sensitive part of the market, how do you approach that from a prioritization perspective and also a problem statement perspective?
I think so. This is some of those questions where the details start to matter, right? Which is, I think it's hard. It's hard for me. The answer is different in one kind of marketplace, and the answer is different in another kind of marketplace. But I think the main thing to think about is, I'll go back to, what can you grease for a while, and sort of when you sort of slowly start to pull it away, does the sort of system still work, right? So for example, like, initially, let's say you've got, I'm going to make a simple example up over here, right? Like, which is, let's say on live shopping, you don't have that many sort of people right now, but you want to encourage people to like, hey, do live shopping on YouTube, etc., etc. So the first couple of times you make it easy for them, you reach out, you maybe don't charge them a fee, maybe you give them an incentive, and once they do it, they see like, oh, I'm getting viewers in, and so now I'll keep going and doing this. But the other hand, you can't go do it in reverse and have a bunch of viewers and say like, oh, look, here's our live shopping destination page. You should show up there, right? So you need to find that loop. You need to find what is the best way to get that thing going. And I think that in the real world, the best example that I see at scale is sort of Uber drivers and people that want Uber rides. You can sort of tell like how they play with marketplace dynamics and like what sort of incentives they provide when they enter a new city. What do they do? And it varies, but like now they have this rich playbook of like, okay, we recruit this many drivers and we give them these incentives for the first couple of months. We give them guarantees, and so I think there's like the details of like what does that particular party need matter. But I think that is the thing that you come up with, right? Like what is a way to like get things started. And I think the important part, and this is where I see a lot of these dynamics sort of fail, is you have to understand how do I get to steady state as fast as possible, right? Because sometimes you feel like, oh, I've got this growing, it's going up into the right, let me keep doing this. But then you sort of forget that incentive has to go away and you have to make the economics work overall. So to me, that the details start to matter and how you dive in starts to matter a bunch.
Right. So I'm hearing it's almost like that area of making sure that there's stability and incentive is a byproduct of really understanding the user's problems at the start.
Yeah.
Just what is the outcome that they want to accomplish, and then what are the incentives that will feed into getting them that boost into that outcome.
Right. That's exactly right. Understand what you want in the steady state and how to get people acting in that way.
Love it. And that's why we can have a whole conversation about activation and like onboarding and getting them started. But I also really want to pull on the thread of that dichotomy between that monetization and user experience, because it sounds like monetization can be, when you look at PMs, there's a bunch of risks that we have to de-risk, right? And it kind of comes from Marty Kagan's book, Inspired, of like that value risk versus viability risk, user experience, usability risk. What challenges do you feel like you face when you're trying to strike the right balance between that monetization piece, because you have to bring viability to business, and the user experience? And then how do you approach resolving those potential conflicts between these two aspects?
I think you have to. So let me start by saying, so I've had to do this a few times. So at this point, it was a long time ago. So 10 years ago, I was the first PM on YouTube live streaming. So I came on to start live streaming. And at the time we realized, oh, this is kind of expensive. The most important thing we need to do is actually make enough money that like it's the infrastructure works. Otherwise, the way we built it at the time, it was just the infrastructure costs of live streaming were really expensive. So then you sort of realize, oh, actually like monetization is critical to even keeping the product alive. Like if you hear the ads team talk about ads and how they interact with search, there's a strong belief, and it's like it's there's a reason it's truly like deeply held, is the ads team needs to work, and like ads need to work to keep the web open and free, right? Like without that, like sort of the web ecosystem itself like doesn't quite hold up. So I think you've got to understand the incentives and you've got to understand the trade-off, right? So roughly, you have to understand the cost of sort of interrupting the user. So let's say, sort of the most common monetization sort of tools are an ad. So you put an ad somewhere on the page or before a video, or like a subscription sort of piece where you ask people to subscribe to content, or like you have a bunch of variants in the middle, right? So you can have people sort of do fan funding or tips and things of that sort. And each of those has a cost. And I think you're sacrificing viewers and viewership for sort of money. But I think like YouTube from day one sort of realized like the monetization is required so that creators make sort of money. And so like without that in the long run, the creators don't come. And so guess what? The site goes away. And by the way, like for that to work, the advertisers need to see value out of the ads. And so it has to work for them. So I think it's important to understand the trade-offs in each of these cases, right? So for example, we sort of know what would happen if you turned off, let's say, ads on Google search. How much better would it be for people? If you turned off ads on YouTube, how much would it be better for your people? But you also understand the costs. Okay, how much less money would we make? What happens to creators? And so finding that balance, right, across your product, which is when this happens, what is the trade-off and what am I giving up is super important. Now, I will say, like, sometimes everything lines up, right? So the example that YouTube often gives is this notion of, skippable ads. So, if you're lining up user incentives, you can skip the ad. You're lining up advertiser incentives because people that actually watch the ad really want to watch the ad. And it turns out like this monetizes better. So you're actually sort of giving creators money as well, right? So that sort of lines up. I sort of say shopping, we're still in the early stages of shopping, but it has the same characteristics, which is when people see a video, like ideally the people watching that like actually want to watch it. And then I think the act of buying something is satisfying to the viewer, but it's also satisfying to everyone in that ecosystem. So one thing to think about is, can you actually align everything? And you can't align it all the time, but sometimes you try to see, okay, can I align my monetization with either for all my customers or some large set of customers and make that part of the product. But otherwise, if you're charging, the dynamics are a little bit simpler.
I know you did this already because I'm trying to grapple my head around this complex, almost like complex mental model relationship of
Yeah.
you have monetization, you have user experiences, you have these loops that are trying to drive said segments,
Yep.
cohorts of people into coming back into the product. And then you have on top of that, making sure that within that monetization piece, there is the right types of content that will drive them back into leveraging YouTube or Google, et cetera, right? Can you elaborate on the various monetization models and strategies that you use then to strike that balance between generating revenue and then you mentioned that optimal user experience? Because obviously there's the platform cost of running a good and stable platform, and on top of that enabling that type of infrastructure to scale. But then you also have, let's say, generating revenue, talking to your merchants, talking to ads, like, and within ads itself it's like a whole big mountain of
Yeah.
a dynamic relationship. So from your perspective, like, how do you, like, what are the top things that you rely on in terms of principles in finding that balance?
I think there's having the principles. So I used to joke. So I worked on search for a long time, and I'd find that every sort of quarter, at least one PM on my team would come to me like somewhat upset with like. So by the way, one of the luxuries on search is most of the time you don't have to think about monetization, right? Which is teams are really focused on, hey, we're focused on the user, and the ads team is doing their stuff. But every quarter, like some PM writing would be like, hey, you know that like I built this feature and now it's doing really well, the queries are growing. Like suddenly ads started showing up on the top of the page, and now like I have to scroll to get to my feature. I'm so upset. And then I was like, hey, someone's got to pay for lunch, right? So it's, you just have to understand that. So I think I think having the principles in place is important, right? So between search and ads, when I worked on Google Search, like there are very clear principles on where ads can be and what to expect and sort of what is right for users and where features live. YouTube similarly, there's extremely clear principles on how much sort of we can sort of get in users way from the content they like, right? You've got to sort of have that balance, and you have to understand that like upsetting the user or giving them the wrong long-term experience is a huge cost, right? Like you might you can double the ads you serve and maybe sort of make a lot more money, but then that user is not going to come back, and so we understand that quite clearly, and we sort of teams run experiments to understand the cost of like, okay, if you do this, what happens? If you do this other thing, that what happens? And finding the right point on that curve so that you sort of give users the experience that they come to expect. And I think Google and YouTube are somewhat, I like to think, unique in that people have a lot of love for the brand and have high expectations of the brand. So you can't sort of go too much on the other side. Like you have to sort of respect that. And so for me, like it is, you want to find that balance. For most PMs on my team, I sort of remind them that they are on the side of the consumer, And so you've got to think about what is the best experience sort of they have. Sometimes I think you can sort of over index on one side, and so sometimes you got to go like, actually, you know what, we need to do more for say merchants for the next couple of quarters so that the balance is back. But I think to me it's really finding that intricate line that's really important. Experiments tell you, and frankly experiments and intuition sort of tell you when you're doing the wrong thing for a particular party. And I think that's the piece to sort of come up with, right? Which is, what is the thing that like sort of, what is that line that you don't need to make sure you don't cross, and everyone in the ecosystem is actually benefiting from. But to me, like monetization is, I think this notion of building sustainable businesses should be something that PMs sort of think about, right? So, which is, what is the, I need to have this plan that really works in the long run, right? Like, I think the there's an odd thing where a lot of consumer products, because of the way ads work, because of the way funding happened for a long time in startups and all this ecosystem, thought, hey, our job is to get as many users as fast as possible, and then we'll figure something out. I think when you frame things in those terms, you end up in these situations, right? Like it's monetization or growth. I think the reality you sort of now, especially, is and you sort of see this in the market, but it's, you sort of have to have a view on, okay, what am I, which dial am I pulling, when am I sort of turning one up versus the other. You need to understand how they interplay.
You have a pretty tricky role, I think, especially as someone who's in more of a leadership position in a huge org like Google and YouTube,
Yeah.
because if it was a scale up or a startup and we're talking about turning those dials, it's pretty not easy per se, but it's easier than where you
Yes.
are because it's just one or two
100%.
or three people making the decision. But now you're with trade-offs of like, well, there's the ads team that has their mandates to drive. You have your shopping team to, right?
Yeah.
And search. So how have you found in terms of your position in trying to establish those trade-offs and being able to negotiate like real estate space essentially?
Yeah. I mean, I think again, it's so having, to your point, like having sort of detailed principles help, right? Which is, hey, write down, like, for example, if we're talking about ads and search, like, where are the ads allowed to go? Like, what are the principles on UI, stuff like that. So I think writing stuff down helps. Also, to your point, I agree. Like, your thing of turning the dial is now like, you need to turn the dial. Like, you need to have like 5 meetings to turn a dial. Basically, you need to go talk to an org, right? But I think a lot of the skill, as frankly as a PM, but especially as a PM leader, ends up being how good you are at getting those dials turned quickly. And I think the way you do that is, I think it's super important to be transparent on what you're doing, right? So when I've run platform teams, I've told the PMs on my team that are sort of in the platform, like, you know, tell everyone how you're prioritizing things, right? Like, make it extremely clear what your rubric is. So if someone comes and says, hey, can you do this? If your answer is yes, you say yes, and here's why. If your answer is no, you say like, here's no, and here's why. And by the way, like, if you disagree, like, come talk to us, but this is our rubric. And so I think it's the same thing, right? Which is, you make it extremely transparent and clear how you're prioritizing, why you're doing what you want to do. And then you sort of, there's also a relationship building aspect of it, right? Which is, people need to understand that you're someone that is, or your team or what you're doing is principled, and they need to sort of, people are still very human, so you need to understand their incentives and say like, okay, they at some point need to trust you, right? Which is, they need to trust that you're doing the right thing for the company, that you're doing the right thing for them, that you won't surprise them. And I think you build that by sort of thinking about what their incentives are, making sure you communicate at the right cadence. But I think that's another PM skill, right? Like, how do you, I always say like there's PMing, and then there's, you need to add a couple of layers for big company PMing. And sometimes you need to unlearn them when you go back to like something smaller, or you're on as part of a small team. But it's good to have those layers available so when you need them.
Yeah, I always use the example of when you're in a bigger org, it's a lot more internal storytelling, a lot more stakeholder management, a lot of communicating the feedback that you get and also the
Yep.
input that you get. And basically saying the same thing over and over again in different ways to different people. Right.
Oh no, I think the repetition will what I find is really important, right? Which is one of my former managers, I think borrowed this from someone else, which is I think the saying is like repetition doesn't spoil the prayer. It's like you just need to like be prepared to like I think Eric Schmidt in a talk said like he's like I need to say something like 20 times and then maybe, when I tell a team something 20 times, then I know it's sort of starting to sink in. And I find that often, right? Which is you write down the principles, but like you need to repeat them very often. You need to remind people a bunch. You need to like understand you need to understand also just human biases a little bit. For example, like again, I'll just sort of branch off into platform story, which is I was relatively new to this job, and there was this team that wanted us to do something. I really thought their project was worthwhile, but we just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. So I spent 25 minutes explaining to them, hey, here's what else is on the floor. Here's what we can do. And literally on the way out, I kind of said, listen, I really like your project. I'm going to try my best to see if we can squeeze things in, but we're still like, we can't do it, but I'm going to try my best. And there was a senior person in the room, a VP, just started laughing on our way out, right? And I was like, what happened? He's like, you realize all they heard was that thing that you said at the end that you're going to try your best. They're like, I was like, no, but I spent 25 minutes telling them, like, that I can't do it. And he's like, no, but like people amplify the thing that they want to hear, right? And so I think since then, sort of being very precise on sort of what you can commit to, and even if you have good intentions, is another really important sort of organizational dynamic framework to have.
And bias is so real, and especially big orgs and even smaller orgs too. People have
Yeah.
almost like a blind spot to saying, oh, that's what I want to hear. I want to latch onto it. And something that I find that's helpful to even gain leverage in the organization usually is leveraging data. And
Yep.
I'm pretty sure Google and YouTube definitely leverages data and analytics when it comes to informing your product decisions, because especially decision making is going to be really crucial when it comes to being data driven. How do you measure then success when it comes to product performance and user satisfaction? And then how do you adapt your strategies and communicate those strategies based on the insights and yeah, and outputs that you gain from those metrics?
Yeah, I think being data, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember where I heard this phrase from, but like I think this notion of being data informed versus data driven, I think is important, right? Which is, I think there's two aspects to what you're saying, right? The first aspect is, I think you have to, especially with results, right? Like I'm still shocked by how many people, teams, startups outside, like teams within Google, teams elsewhere that I talk to, that like they don't have great dashboards on day one, right? Which is the number of launches I've been on where, I ask them like, all right, great, congratulations on the launch. Like, can you tell me what this stat is, this stat is, this stat is? And they'll be like, yeah, it's like the logging's not quite there, or something's off, or like something's super common, right? And again, I think partially it's because getting that right takes time. And sometimes we don't have the incentives to like, we're trying to rush out something and that becomes easy to drop and say like, we'll add later. But I think having that on day one is critical because you need to have an understanding of like, okay, like metrics ultimately and your dashboards are metrics ultimately are sort of an expression of your strategy and if your tactics are working, right? Which is, hey, this is my plan, this is what I want to do. If I do them, these things will change, and because of that, like here's this bigger number that I want to change. So all of those things, like your leading metrics, your sort of North Star metrics, the metrics you publish, all of those really you should ideally have on day one. Now, the reality is often that slips, and so, but I sort of as PMs, like I feel like okay, you need some way to like even if you're just manually pulling that until you have great dashboards, you need to know those numbers, right? So I think being very attuned to that is really important. The second part of data is I think it's important to like deeply understand what people are seeing. Think like what do PMs bring, right? Ultimately, we bring good decision making and deep empathy with consumers. How do you develop that? You sit and watch them do it. But another way to sort of develop that is to see how they use the product. So I think something I love to do is like, look at look at sessions, like how are people sort of actually experiencing the product? How are they feeling? Like what sort of, if they type in a search result, what sort of videos do they get, right? You've got to experience that. And that is also data. And so to me, like I think using data to sort of live your customer's experience, using data to understand the metrics and sort of see like, okay, what is happening, where they're dropping off, what's going on, is how you build intuition, and it's how all your decisions should be made. I think the other aspect of data is just being disciplined and hitting metrics and understanding costs and all of that stuff. And I think there's a rich, it's really interesting. Even at a company like Google, every team is very different. But I think by and large, we have a pretty decent culture around sort of using data and being data driven and driving things forward.
Yeah, and going back to your point about latching on to specific inputs and outputs, it's also really important to avoid that analytics theater, as I call it, where it's one of my previous managers said,
Analytics theater, I like that phrase.
Exactly. It's like, not being data rich, decision poor is going to
Yes.
be really key, right? Because a lot of times people look at one little bump in, let's say, in all time, you see a little bump of thing. It's like, causation
Yes.
of
I've
specific.
been in those meetings.
Yeah.
And
What
then,
do you do?
no, I remember there's a really strong PM in my team who unfortunately was on a product for a while where the data was extremely unreliable. And I remember he once came and he's like, look at this crazy growth. And I was like, from this team, I just assume it's a logging bug. But if you're convinced that it's not, can you come and tell me in a couple of days? And he's like, no, it was actually growth. And but it took him like a week. I was like, I'm fairly certain this is like a logging bug. Because often it was.
Yeah.
But no, but I to your point, I think what you're saying is true, right? There's this sort of we've I love your phrase analytics theater because it's perfect. Like it describes many sort of large meetings I've been in where everyone shares their dashboard or it's in a slide and you go like, oh, look at this. Like, what does this mean? And you're like, no, actually, we can figure it out. It can be a smaller group. So I've 100% seen that.
I love that. I also know, speaking of presenting things, you have been so gracious with your time. I wanted to maybe leave a minute for a segment that I just came up in my head as we were talking, which is a rapid fire round.
Oh,
So let's maybe start. Maybe I'll give you 5 questions to answer. So
okay.
number 1, what is your favorite breakfast that you have before you start your day?
Oh, so I don't have it every day, but some days there's a Google cafe that serves chicken congee, and I don't get it at home. And so I make sure I go there because it's hard. Like I don't make it at home. So I go there, I get chicken congee, I put a bunch of like fried onion things, a bunch of sriracha sauce. And so once a week, that's what I end up. I think that's my like favorite breakfast if I can swing it to that cafe once a week.
Wow, I'm jealous. Number 2, what is the most recent book you've read?
What is the most recent? I just actually I just started it. It's over here. It's Steve Martin's autobiography. I just started this one.
Yeah.
I haven't finished it. I'm sort of like I'd say a third of the way in.
Okay. Well, favorite Ted Lasso quote that you have?
Be curious, not judgmental. That is, technically, I guess it's not. It is, I guess, a Walt Whitman quote that like Ted Lasso uses, but that is my favorite Ted Lasso quote.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Neither. I drink neither. I think this is my source of caffeine, Diet Coke.
Well, that's also another. I should add that. Diet Coke, coffee or tea.
Coffee or tea, yeah.
Last thing, what is one advice you'd give to someone who's looking to level up in their PM career or break into peak product?
Both are slightly different, right? Which is, so if you're breaking into product, I think the easiest thing to do is find ways to already sort of start doing the job. Because I think there isn't, unlike engineering, there isn't like a, sort of do these courses, get through these technical interviews and you're in sort of piece. So I think the key is starting to develop product intuition, either starting to work with engineers or other product teams to show like I have customer insight or I sort of can help you with these things is really important. So finding ways to do the job before you have the job is, I think, is key. And sometimes you need to do it through side projects. Sometimes if you're in school, you do it through like something on the side. Like I think that's really important. I think to level up, I think there's an element of like, I always ask people like it's important to understand where you want to go with your career before you figure out what the level up answer is, right? Which is there a particular domain that you want to go in to, or is there like you've decided I want to be this kind of PM, but then you need to understand, okay, what am I missing? Do I need more UX skills? Am I someone that like needs to communicate better? Am I someone that needs to be better at strategy? And what is the job? I always tell people like, think about what is the job you want 5 years from now, and say like, okay, how do I get there? I think that's a good way to think about leveling up because that's that'll sort of guide you. Because otherwise, I worry that everyone sort of thinks about, okay, how do I just get promoted? Which sometimes is the right thing, but very often, or like go to another job where I'm paid a little bit more or it seems a little better. That could be the right thing, but very often that's not. I think it's worth thinking about what is it that I actually want and what's a path that'll help me get there.
Amazing advice. Thank you, Satyajit. Is there a place that people can find you if they wanted to chat or read more about your?
I'm trying to get better at my Substack. I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter a bunch. So on Twitter, I'm Salgar. My last name is my handle. I guess I should call it X now. Whatever it is, I still call it Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn as Salgar. Yeah, I think those are the places to find me.
Sounds good. I'll drop your links in the bio if anyone wants to reach out. Thank you so much for your time, Satyajeet. Like this was.
Thank you. This was great. I really enjoyed. I always love talking products, and this is a great conversation.